Debt is older than money itself. Before coins, before markets, before the concept of currency even existed, civilization already had debt, and it already had victims. This is the story of how ancient Mesopotamia invented the ledger, and with it, the first economic collapse. 5,000 years ago, in the land between two rivers, something unprecedented happened. The Sumerians invented writing. Not for poetry, not for prayers, for accounting. Cuneiform tablets weren't literature, they were receipts, records of grain stored, livestock counted, labor owed. This was Sumer, modern-day Iraq, the cradle of civilization, where agriculture created surplus, where surplus created cities, and where cities created something far more complex, the temple economy. Temples weren't just religious centers. They were the first banks, the first warehouses, the first institutions that could store wealth across seasons and track obligations across time. And that's where debt was born. The mechanism was simple, brutally simple. A farmer plants barley in spring, but he needs seed, tools, and food until harvest. So he borrows from the temple or a wealthy neighbor. The loan is recorded on clay, measured in shekels of silver, not physical coins, but units of weight used for accounting. When harvest comes, he repays, with interest. Interest wasn't invented by Wall Street. It was formalized in ancient Mesopotamia around 3000 BC, typically 20 to 33% annually for grain loans. This interest rate wasn't arbitrary. It reflected agricultural risk. One bad harvest, one flood, one drought, and the farmer couldn't repay. When he couldn't repay, the debt didn't disappear, it compounded. Next season, he owed more, and eventually something had to be surrendered. First, land, then livestock, then tools, finally, freedom itself. This was debt slavery, not metaphorical, literal. When a man couldn't pay, his children became collateral, his wife became collateral, he became collateral. Families were broken apart, sold to creditors as bonded labor, working off debts that grew faster than they could ever repay. By 2000 BC, debt slavery had become so widespread it threatened the stability of entire city-states. Enter the Code of Hammurabi, 1800 BC, Babylon. One of the first comprehensive legal codes in history, and a significant portion of it deals with debt. Law 48. If a man has a debt and a storm destroys his crops, he doesn't have to repay that year. The interest is canceled. Law 117. If a man sells his wife, son, or daughter for debt, they shall work 3 years in the house of their purchaser. In the 4th year, they shall be set free. These weren't acts of mercy. They were systemic risk management. Hammurabi understood something fundamental. Unchecked debt doesn't just destroy individuals, it destroys societies. When too many farmers lose their land, food production collapses. When too many families are enslaved, military recruitment fails. When too many citizens lose freedom, revolt becomes inevitable. The code capped interest rates, regulated collateral, limited debt slavery to 3 years. But Hammurabi went further. He issued something radical, a royal decree of debt forgiveness. In Akkadian, amargi, literally, return to mother, the cancellation of all outstanding debts, a clean slate. This wasn't unique to Hammurabi. It was standard practice across Mesopotamia. New kings, upon ascending the throne, would often proclaim an economic reset. Debts were voided, debt slaves were freed, land returned to original owners. Why? Political stability. A king facing a population crushed by debt faced rebellion. Debt cancellation was cheaper than civil war. But here's where it gets interesting and darker. These resets weren't acts of morality, they were political tools. Kings used debt forgiveness strategically to consolidate power, to reward supporters, to destabilize rivals. If you were a creditor, a wealthy merchant or temple priest, you lost everything when the king proclaimed amargi. Your loans evaporated, your collateral freed. This created a perverse cycle. Creditors knew periodic resets were coming, so they lent more aggressively before resets,
extracted value faster, took harder collateral. Borrowers knew resets were possible, so some borrowed recklessly, gambling on political change. The system didn't eliminate debt, it made it weaponized. And when resets stopped, when kings became weak or creditors became too powerful, the collapse accelerated. By 2000 BC, Sumerian city-states were fracturing. By 1750 BC, the region had fragmented into competing powers. By 539 BC, Babylon itself fell to Persia. Debt didn't destroy these civilizations directly, but it eroded them, concentrated wealth upward, destabilized populations, created cycles of crisis and reset that exhausted institutional trust. Now look at the modern world. Student loans, mortgage debt, credit cards, sovereign bonds, derivatives. The mechanisms have evolved, the ledgers are digital, but the structure is identical. Borrow today, repay tomorrow with interest, and if you can't repay, lose collateral, freedom, future. And when the system becomes unstable, when too many can't repay, when banks hold too much bad debt, when the structure threatens collapse, what happens? A reset. 2008, the global financial crisis, banks holding trillions in bad mortgage debt, the system freezing. And the response? Bailouts, quantitative easing, central banks printing money to absorb losses. Not debt cancellation, not a margee, but functionally similar. A transfer of liability from private creditors to public institutions. A reset disguised as monetary policy. Or look at sovereign debt. Argentina defaulted 9 times. Greece restructured. Venezuela collapsed. Each time the same question. Do you honor the debts and destroy the population, or do you reset the debts and destroy the creditors? Hammurabi faced this choice. So did every Babylonian king. So does every modern government. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Ancient Mesopotamian resets worked because they were authoritarian. A king decreed it, and it happened. Modern democracies can't do that. Creditors are voters. Bondholders are pensioners. Banks are employers. Resetting debt in a complex, interconnected financial system doesn't just free debtors, it bankrupts institutions, crashes markets, destroys savings. So instead of clean resets, we get managed decay. Inflation eroding debt slowly. Negative interest rates taxing savers. Bailouts transferring losses to taxpayers. The debt never disappears, it just migrates. From individuals to banks, from banks to governments, from governments to central banks, and eventually to currency itself. Sumer invented the ledger, and with it, the first collapse. They discovered that debt is power. The ability to record obligations across time is the foundation of civilization. It enables investment, planning, growth. But they also discovered that debt is instability, that obligations compound faster than production, that inequality accelerates until systems break. And they invented the reset, the recognition that when debt becomes unpayable, it must be canceled or the society collapses. The cycle repeated for 3,000 years. Debt, crisis, reset, rebuild, repeat. Until finally, the resets stopped working. The system became too complex, the interests too entrenched, the collapse too complete. Babylon fell, not to a single conqueror, but to the accumulated weight of centuries of extraction, obligation, and unresolved crisis. So here's the question that echoes across 5 millennia. Every civilization resets its debts, through jubilee, through inflation, through default, through war. But what happens when ours can't? When the global financial system is so interconnected that resetting one debt crashes 1,000 others? When currencies are backed by debt, and debt is backed by future growth, and future growth is backed by more debt? The Sumerians had an answer. The amargi, the clean slate. We don't. We have central banks printing currency, governments accumulating debt that can never be repaid, promises that depend on perpetual expansion in a finite world. And when the expansion stops, history has already shown us what comes next. Not a reset, a collapse. Sumeria invented debt, and debt eventually invented their end. The only question is whether we're smart enough to learn from them, or arrogant enough to believe we're different.